So your country has imported millions and millions of third worlders. And now after seeing how amazing and great this all has been working out, you ask yourself if it is possible to reverse this beautiful cultural gift. And if it is possible, will it actually happen? The process of reversing mass migration is called remigration. To understand the different approaches to remigration, let's look at migration first. Or to be more precise, at the 3 different approaches to handle the challenges of multiculturalism. The Eastern European approach, the Western approach, and the approach countries like the Emirates and Russia are taking. Other countries not in this list can still somehow be fitted into one of these categories. The Eastern European approach, which countries like Poland, Belarus and Hungary took, is the easiest to explain. You just don't let anyone in and you are done. The Western approach is to let everybody in. And when conflicts arise, which is not surprising because humans are inherently tribalistic by nature, they start trying to dismantle this tribalism through the means of cultural guilt. But for whatever reason, this process is only applied to the native indigenous population. The migrants, on the other hand, are still allowed to be proud of their ancestry and heritage, fly their own flag, and maintain their very strict traditional family structures. When the migrants complain about racism, the native population feels so guilty that they start abolishing century-old cultural practices. They start renaming historic streets and then rapidly ramp up so-called hate speech laws, because otherwise they will not be able to maintain their cultural guilt. And this is the only way to make the Western approach to mass migration work. On the other side of the spectrum, you have countries like the Emirates or Russia, where the natives have absolutely zero guilt towards immigrants. They also have massive amounts of immigration, but none of the problems which the West has. If you are surprised about Russia having mass migration, they mostly come from former Soviet countries, especially the Central Asian ones. So if you move there and start calling everybody a racist and demand that they start moderating their own language and how they should change their own culture just to protect your feelings, they will look at you like you're retarded. Because you are. Nobody forces you to move to Russia. Nobody forces you to move to Dubai. Imagine a bunch of gays move to Dubai and demand homosexual marriage. They will be told to go back to Canada. So is the solution for the West to just become like Dubai or Russia and give up their idea of remigration completely? No, because this approach has one massive flaw and is inferior to the solution which Poland, for example, has chosen. The massive caveat here is that while their approach may preserve the culture of the natives, you still have to mitigate the fallout of mass migration through really strict laws and very harsh prison sentences. So let's explain the alternative, especially to my American viewers who believe that more guns and more death penalties are the only way to reduce crime. Let's imagine you walk into a neighborhood which is 100% completely Amish, or maybe 100% Orthodox Jewish. Do you really think somebody over there will stab you with a knife and steal your smartphone? Do you really believe that this is the neighborhood where people worry about locking their houses? No, because it works. It is a tightly knit, homogeneous, high trust community. Most of Europe used to be like this and it was amazing. And all of that while having the mildest prison sentences ever. This is the desired outcome of remigration, at least in theory. Unfortunately, remigration is no longer possible in every country. For the United States, in my view, it is already way too late. It is not just that they went from 90% of people having exclusively European ancestry to less than 60, but they were never an ethnically coherent and homogeneous population in the first place. For them, having American citizenship means that you are a full-blown American. This is unique and different from almost all other countries. If I move to China, get a Chinese citizenship, spend my entire life there, I will still never be Chinese. The only thing Americans can try to do right now is to send all illegals back home and hope that this will somehow reduce the strain on the taxpayer. But looking at the tiny and minuscule amounts of people which Trump has deported, you can forget it. This entire ICE circus which Trump is orchestrating right now is maybe enough to look like a tough guy on Fox News, but it is light years away from actually improving anything. Western Europe is in a different situation right now and still has a chance to preserve their ethno-cultural continuity. Before we dig into which countries are screwed and which are not, are there actually any countries where the natives went from being a minority back to becoming a dominant majority again? Yes, and for that let's look at the Soviet Union. The Soviets used to mass deport every single ethnicity which they they didn't like, either to Siberia or to Kazakhstan. So they took Ukrainians from Ukraine, Polish from Poland, and even some Koreans from Korea, and many more. They deported so many ethnicities into Kazakhstan that roughly 70% of the entire country was made up exclusively out of foreigners. This was still the case up until just a few decades ago. When the Soviet Union collapsed, all the Ukrainians, Polish, Germans and so on decided to remigrate back to their original home countries. It took them a decade or maybe two, but now Kazakhstan has only 30% of foreigners left. Most of them are ethnic Russians in the north, and in theory, with enough political willpower, you could reduce this down to 15 or even 5%. So it is possible. But what has to change in the West to build up enough political willpower? Public opinion always falls right into the middle of both extremes. On one extreme, it is completely acceptable to put cars on fire and to beat up people who they perceive to be Nazis. On the other side, you have people who just want to reverse the last few decades of mass immigration. And if this is the most extreme view on the right, which is still socially acceptable, I don't see how the moderates in the middle will ever get there. The only thing which moves the middle slightly further to the right, even if just by a very tiny amount, is the fact that we have Twitter. But the problem with that is that the European right is relying way too much on Elon Musk, so they have to take one of these three ways to fix it. They either have to get rid of so-called hate speech laws and then wait 5 to 10 years for public discourse to get where they want it to be. Or second, a different country has to be the first to implement remigration successfully. This will show the rest of the world that it is not only possible, but it will showcase the positive impact, for example, on the housing markets and on crime rates. After that, more countries will feel empowered to do the same. Or the last option, they just wait until the situation becomes so bad that people have nothing to lose and finally stop caring about so-called hate speech laws. The problem with the last approach is that by the time they get there, it will likely be too late. There is this meme in the far right going around that if the moderate solution will fail, society will just escalate to a more extreme approach. And while I agree that remigration is the moderate solution, the truth is, if that one fails too, there will be no extreme alternative. There will be no second chance. You just become a third world country and that's it. The only thing natives can try to do after this has happened is to self-segregate into enclaves where they are actually safe and can protect their own culture and identity. And if you have to self-segregate in your own country, congratulations, you have achieved diversity. So let's look at different approaches to remigration. You have the post-Soviet approach, which I have described earlier, where the living standards in the host country collapses very rapidly, while at the same time their original home country saw a significant improvement in terms of living standards. In that situation, people will decide to remigrate back purely by their own choice. But waiting until Europe collapses could take a decade or maybe even two. And in the meantime, nobody is rebuilding the countries from which all of these migrants are originally from. So this approach is not feasible. Then you have the authoritarian approach, where you just take all the people you don't like, put them into a train and send them home. In practice, this solution is completely infeasible thanks to decades and decades worth of European bureaucracy. Getting rid of all of these complicated laws within a reasonable time frame is only possible if you manage to seize absolute power in one single move. And if you fail, it will backfire so badly it literally throws the entire continent into a civil war. This is not the future you want to live in. Just consider how much pushback Trump has received after he deported just a very small amount of people. Now imagine how much worse it will be in Western Europe, where the extreme left is so much more dominant. That's why this approach is not feasible either. The last and most realistic approach to remigration is the one popularized by Martin Sellner, where the idea is to apply remigration pressure in a way that is completely compliant with all the European laws and constitutions. His plan contains 3 different steps: close the borders, send back all illegals, and apply pressure on naturalized but non-assimilated citizens. The thing is, with the extreme slow pace at which the far right is growing right now, by the time they actually get into parliament, all the migrants will not only have already crossed the borders, but also all of them will be naturalized citizens. This is why only the last point is practical in my opinion. So how is he going to do this in a way which is legal and compliant? Because in these jurisdictions it is impossible to treat immigrants differently from natives. So if you introduce such incentives incentives, they have to apply to everybody. So if you ban stuff like halal meat, hijabs and circumcisions, you have to do this for all citizens, no matter whether they are immigrants or natives. And then the next phase of step 3 is just to wait until all the people you don't like will just go back to their home countries. Good luck with that. Of course, if this plan ever gets implemented, there will be more or less aggressive variants. This depends highly on the country which is implementing these measures. It could be possible that some countries will find completely legal ways to denaturalize people in masses. But I only believe it when I see it. Because if you actually get to the point where you can send people back home, you will see massive protests all over the continent. And if you look at how Trump pulled out of Minnesota after just a tiny little bit of pushback, you can imagine how much worse it will be in most European countries. So which country will be the first one to implement remigration? Everybody is talking about Restore Britain in the UK right now, but if you look at Austria, their local right-wing counterpart is at almost 40%. So Austria will likely be the turning point where the right could finally win the absolute majority for the very first time and become a leading example. But for other countries, I'm not sure they will make it at all. In my view, the most likely outcome is that the traditional Europe, which we used to have 2 decades ago, will only continue to exist in a small cluster of countries. And that will be Austria, Hungary, Slovakia, the Czech Republic and probably Poland. We have to wait and see until one country goes first and then hopefully everybody else follows. Until then, the job is just to get elected, but also to prevent the right from falling apart over stupid internal arguments. Because right now, most right-wing parties are internally divided into 2 competing groups and they hate each other. And this could be one of the reasons why you are completely screwed and voting far right may not even save you.